fathers of Western historiography. His name is Thucydides, son of Olorus, which is not a Greek name. And so on his father's side, there's a relative up in the family tree who was Thracian. And Thracians were non-Greeks. They lived in what's roughly Bulgaria today. But what's interesting is that Greeks and non-Greeks might actually contract either marital relations or, possibly in this case, friendly relations, such that the daughter of a non-Greek man could marry the son of a Greek man. And that's what happened in the case of Thucydides. And it led to him actually inheriting very valuable silver mine shares, as we'd call them today, but an interest in northern Greece. So you probably know that around the north part of the Aegean, I mean it's here on this map, but right up the north, it says Macedon there. Well, there's a very strong amount of both silver and gold, and Thucydides' wealth on his father's side derived from that access to wealth. I'll say a bit more about him later on. This is, for the ancient Greeks, a world war, and the Greek worldview was extremely limited in the 5th century BC, BCE. Just to give you one illustration, 100 years later, Alexander the Great, having been taught by Aristotle, and among other things being taught geography, he gets to what we call Pakistan, and he wants to press on. He's just won a major battle at a river called Hydaspes in Greek, the Jhelum in modern times. And he imagines that the ocean, Okeanos, which Greeks imagined as surrounding the inhabited world, was just a little bit further on. So he didn't know anything about China. So if I can put it that way, forget the New World, they knew absolutely nothing about that. Forget Australasia, but they didn't even know about China. You have to wait for the Romans. And yet, the reason I put on the screen here, twofold reason. I'm going to come to one of them, which is historical, that this actually mattered. It made a difference to how the war evolved and ended. But my main point is, here's Greece. You can barely see it on the map. And this is absolutely vast. And the Persian Empire developed in the 6th century BC. Beginning of the 5th, so 490 and then 480, they had a go at conquering that little bit. And you ask yourself, why bother? They've got all this. Why did they want that? Well, it's the usual thing. Empires expand and they reach a limit. And just over the border, there's a wretched people that interferes in your sphere. So the Persians considered all Asia theirs, a kind of automatic birthright. So Europe is available. They conquered Macedon before they had to go at the rest of mainland Greece. They got Macedon, they failed to conquer Greece. And it's an irony that the conquest of all that started from there. So it's a complete reversal. You'd never have predicted that anybody from there would reach to here, which is Afghanistan and Pakistan, and conquer it and Hellenize it, make it Greek in its uppermost layers of culture, language, administration. I mean, it's absolutely unpredictable. We're 100 years before Alexander today, if you can imagine yourself towards the end of the 5th century. So 430s, 20s, 410s, our period. So I've done your handout because there aren't many obvious ways of illustrating the Peloponnesian War through slides. So there aren't artifacts which speak in the way that if you were to do a lecture on Alexander, and this of course is a lecture, slide lecture on Alexander that I've got on the screen here, then there are lots and lots of artifacts and scenery that would make a sense. But what I'm going to do is paint a picture for you in words of what I consider to be the most important military engagements, ultimately determining which side, and there are basically only two sides, was going to win. But I've started out after a quotation from a much later Greek source, a man called Pausanias, who came from Asia Minor, so somewhere in the middle here, what's now Western Turkey. But he was terribly keen to recreate the world of Greece before the Romans came. And the Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, beginning in the late 3rd, so the 220s, and then from then on. And he wanted, oh dear, if only the Romans had never come, let's go back. He was a nostalgic person. So within his purview was this war. And in, as it happens, book 3, he wrote, until then, that is until the last 3 decades of the 5th century BCE, Hellas, which means the entirety of the Greek world, the word Graecia is Latin, and it's diminishing, it's demeaning, because the Greeks were not Graeci, they were Hellenes. There were Graikoi up in the northeast of the mainland, but they were just a piffling, small local people. Hellas is all of the Mediterranean and around the Black Sea, wherever Greeks settled. And he says, until what we call the Peloponnesian War, Hellas had walked with her feet well planted on the ground, but that war shook her from her foundations, and the metaphor, the image, is of an earthquake, and of course Greece is very prone to earthquakes, so his fellow countrymen, reading him in the 2nd century of our era, AD, would have known what he was talking about. Most important, apart from the sources, which I'm going to come back to, is my approach, and this may be a shock to sort. No, I've used this before, because I'm not, as it were, a battleground historian. You see what I mean? I'm less interested in exactly how particular battles were fought, for which the evidence usually is extremely poor, and people have differing reconstructions. And to take you through, for example, the 2 ways in which the ancient historians wrote up the Battle of Arginusai, and then the way modern historians have decided, should we go with this historian's account or that historian? That is not my modus operandi. So I am a polemologist, which means that I'm somebody logos. I'm interested in the study of, the theory of war as a social phenomenon. So it includes economics, it includes politics, of course it includes commissariat, all the other dimensions of fighting a battle, equipment, ships, but I'm less interested in the mechanics than I am in the symbolic understanding of what war is and means and why people fight, as much as how they fight. So that's in terms of my approach. Now, Saul started by asking me dates for the, as it were, Atheno-Peloponnesian War. Well, roughly the same bunches of opponents. So Sparta and her allies on one side, Athens and her allies on the other, had begun fighting in earnest as early as 460 BCE. Now you have to put that in context of, I mentioned already, the Persians tried desperately to conquer mainland Greece. 490 Battle of Marathon, 480, 479, 4 major battles by land, by sea, and the Greeks, led by Athens and Sparta, those Greeks who were brave enough to resist, only 30 plus, when in this area there are something like 700 separate political communities or peoples, only 32 or 33 united to resist this massive invasion, the biggest one before D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. Ancient Greek history is puzzling. So, some people say the Peloponnesian Wars began in 460. They were interrupted first in 445. There was a treaty, a peace, 30 years peace, which lasted 14 years. So they started again, 431, and then they stopped again in 421. So why, when along comes a historian who's got the benefit of hindsight, Thucydides, born in the 450s, actual participant until he was exiled in 424 and spent the rest of the campaigning in exile from Athens. Why didn't he begin in 460, as opposed to where he really did begin, 432, 431? So that's the answer. The problem with the question is it's not easy to answer. But thanks to Thucydides, who decided that though there was a peace in 421, it lasted only 7 years to 414, and then in earnest it started again in 413 and continued to 404. And Thucydides, looking back, decided that it was one war. Now, he had one particular reason for wanting it to be a 27-year-long war. Can anybody think what that reason might have been? Do, by the way, intervene if there's at any point you're not sure what I'm saying or you want to make an intervention. Well, the reason is Homer's war, and all Greeks knew Homer, the Iliad, and that was the greatest war Greeks had ever fought against a foreign enemy, Trojans. Only 10 years. Well, I speak as a historian, nonsense. It couldn't possibly have lasted 10 years, just in reality. But Thucydides wanted his war to be bigger, first of all, than Homer's, and then who was his immediate predecessor and model and rival, Herodotus. And his war, well, depends where you take it. We know where he ended. And you could say wars between Greeks and non-Greeks, including Persians, go back into what we call the 6th century, so the 500s. But in practice, the last books 7, 8, 9 are the 480-479, and that was the wars against the Medes. Interestingly, Greeks, rather like the Romans, were very rude about Greeks, calling them all Graikoi. Well, all this long, here's Persia, which is the center of the Persian Empire. Medes come from North Persia, Persians come from southern Iran, and yet Greeks dismissed or minimized the Persians by calling them Medes, who were actually related to them, had previously conquered them, and therefore the Persians were subjects before they turned the tables and became the top dog in Iran and then spread east and west. So sources, I've said a bit about Thucydides. There is one other contemporary in the sense that he used a source which is nearer to the Peloponnesian War, I'm going to call it that for short, than he was. Diodorus was a Greek from Sicily who wrote in the 1st century of BC, so in between roughly 60 and 30, something like that BC. But his main source for the 5th century, because he wrote a history chronologically, year by year, going back hundreds of years. So when he gets to the 5th century, he uses a man called Ephorus, who came from Asia Minor, a place called Kimi. And so you can set side by side Thucydides' year-by-year account of 431 until Thucydides suddenly breaks off in mid-sentence. So why was that? Well, he must have died, and he must have been unable to complete. And it's in the midsummer of 411 when his war, the 27-year war, still has 7 years to go, till 404. Diodorus survives complete, it's book 12, roughly. And we get such a very different feel. So Diodorus's battle narratives tend to be very samey. They're sort of routine, they're sort of variations on a common theme. Thucydides are very different because though he might not, of course he couldn't be a participant or an eyewitness of every single one, he could talk to eyewitnesses. And at the beginning of his work, and it's one reason we think of him as one of our ancestors, historiographically speaking, he talks about his method, and he says he asked eyewitnesses, and they had a problem because they gave different reports. Well, of course they do. I mean, if you're in the middle of a battle, how much of the totality are you likely to be able to access, let alone remember? And then, of course, interest. He points out that people have different outlooks, different points of view. We would say different agendas. So they remember particular things and then recount them in particular ways. We all do this. There's nothing peculiar about Greeks in the later 5th century. So my main point is that the evidence is there. We actually have contemporary narratives for at least up to 411, and then we have Diodorus using Ephorus for after 411. But they are all partial in both senses of that word, not complete and biased. If you wish to follow up my talk by looking at Thucydides and Diodorus, I put on the handout what I consider to be the best contemporary English translation of Thucydides, whose Greek is so difficult that ancient Greeks sometimes were at a loss to know what exactly he was trying to say. But when he's giving a narrative, that is events, as opposed to writing a speech which involves concepts, his Greek is easier. Anyway, Jeremy Minot did an edition, and interestingly it's within a series on political thought. So you might think, why would a historian be translated and put into a Cambridge University Press series on historical thought? Well, the reason is political thought, because some people regard Thucydides as a kind of proto-political scientist, because he's an analyst of war, an analyst of interstate relations. What makes one political entity wish to fight another? And he writes speeches which, of course, he couldn't have known exactly what people said unless he happened to be there. But even then, he couldn't possibly remember absolutely everything that they had actually said. But he is capable of writing a speech that would have been given in Sparta. Well, he couldn't possibly have been there. He's quite unlikely to have Spartan informants. But he puts into the mouth of Athenian speakers in Sparta at a crucial debate. And the debate is, have the Athenians broken the terms of the Treaty of 445, the 30 years peace? If they have, Sparta will say the Athenians have broken the pact, not only with us, but with the gods, in whose name we swore the treaty, so that anybody who breaks it is committing sacrilege. Spartans would then be free. They would believe themselves to be justified in taking the fight to Athens, starting the war again. And that, in my view, is what happened. But I should say, there are people who take an opposite view. They think the Spartans were provoked into it. They were not spoiling for a fight, but actually found themselves, gosh, if we don't respond now, then the Athenians are going to diminish us in some other way, in particular by threatening our alliance. So I won't go any further into that. I've suggested a few modern readings here. Philip de Souza is in the Osprey series. I don't know if anybody's used an Osprey book ever. Well, that is the sort of thing which uses as many contemporary illustrations as it's possible, including reconstructions of what people might have looked like in conflict, in combat, what they wore, how they would have actually clashed, including at sea. So if you want something like that, short, snappy, and very vivid. Victor Hansen, you may have come across him as a political pundit. He's a man of extreme right-wing views. And over the Iraq War, that's when he really got going as a political pundit. And he was summoned in by Cheney and asked for his advice on how to conduct the Iraq War. He is a brilliant historian of, in this case, ancient Greek warfare. And he takes a quotation, it's from Thucydides, of course, a war like no other. And this is the point, that as Thucydides saw it, there had never been a war on the scale, on the variety, with the damage to life and limb, the amount of terrible things like plagues and earthquakes, all happening within a space of 27 years. So a war like no other. And then Jenny Roberts, a more balanced, because less militarily focused. Her title gives you a clue. In 430 BC, the Athenians, quite unpredictably, experienced a great plague. And scholars, doctors today still argue. We actually have the bones of people who died from it, but there isn't sufficient evidence of a scientific kind to make it absolutely clear what the nature of the plague then was, because partly illnesses, diseases evolve, and therefore it's possible that in the modern world, since scientific evidence has been applied, there is no exact descendant or equivalent of the plague that hit Athens in 430. But it's thought to be generally a form of typhus or typhoid fever. Very, very nasty. Thucydides caught it, but survived. Pericles caught it, but died. That's just to give you an example of two very, very famous Athenians of that period. Thucydides survived to write it up, and the modern historian, the German Leopold von Ranke, believed that Thucydides' account, well, that is what writing how it actually was, which is a phrase of von Ranke, actually is. So for him, Thucydides was his ultimate model of what it is to be a historian, and a good one. So that's background in terms of sources and modern work. Principal antagonists. Well, we tend to say it was a war between Sparta and Athens. Well, yes, it was, but both protagonists had quite extensive alliances, and they are what we call offensive and defensive alliances, military alliances, such that if somebody attacks an ally of yours, you are bound to defend that ally within the alliance. So you can immediately think, I think, of certain modern parallels. And on the Athenian side, they are principally naval alliance. On the Spartan side, are principally land-based, infantry-based, not cavalry, infantry-based alliance. And the Athenian alliance tends to be called, it's just a modern term, the Delian League, because the oaths which brought the alliance into being in the 470s, after they'd fought back the Persian invasion, was they were sworn on the sacred island of Delos in the middle of the Cyclades, the Cyclades in the Aegean. And so somebody who examined my doctoral thesis, he came up with two anachronistic but modern equivalents. The Warsaw Pact powers become the Delos Pact powers. So we're back to the Cold War of the 60s and 70s. And on the other hand, this is a pun, of course, ATO, not NATO, but ATO, the Aegean Treaty Organization. And that's the way to think about it. Now, on your handout, on the back, you have a map which shows you marked what the Athenian alliance included, and then marked in hatching, to sloping hatching, what the Peloponnesian. Sorry. So you may have noticed Jeremy Minot's translation of Thucydides, he translated as the war of the Athenians and the Peloponnesians, the other way around, but the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. So Thucydides sometimes refers to the Spartan alliance as the Peloponnesians. And modern scholars, what's the equivalent on the Spartan side of the Delian League? It's the Peloponnesian League, because most of the allies of Sparta were within the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. Some were outside, and not all inside the Peloponnese were allies of Sparta. There's one in particular, Argos, which was a devoted enemy, always, of Sparta, and therefore sometimes looked outside, my enemy's enemy is my friend, to Athens as a potential ally against Sparta. In the background, and actively, as I've put here, from 412, is the Persian Empire. Now that says circa 500, it was pretty much the same, circa 431, 4112, 404, whenever it didn't actually lose a significant part of it, which is Egypt, until about 404, and that's right when the war we're looking at today ended. After that, Egypt revolted. It was in revolt for 60 odd years, but the Persian Empire remained solid. And why from 412? Well, when we come to it, we'll see. Athens was very weak in 412. Sparta thought this is the moment to apply to Persia to come and help us, because Athens was always Persia's principal enemy in Greece, in the Greek world. And so they actually did very well out of the Persians, who funded them to a great extent, and in particular enabled them to build fleets. Now, if you think of it, Sparta is well inland. I don't know if anybody's been to Sparta, but it's well inland. It has a port, but unfortunately the port was in the territory of people who, yes, they're part of the Spartan state, but they're not Spartans. They're not full Spartan citizens. So Sparta's relationship with the sea was always a little bit distant and indirect, and the principal ally of the Spartans in the naval sphere was Corinth. And Corinth, on the isthmus here, has harbours on both sides, west and east, and so was in a position to build up, and very early on seems to have got into naval warfare as early as the 600s. So we're going back a couple of centuries from where we're looking at in the 5th century. So what I didn't put here, and I now introduce, is the types of armaments on both sides. And I'm going to pass around here. This is Ancient Warfare magazine, and I imagine it's the sort of magazine that you guys would probably buy. Anyway, this latest issue happens to be about the period before the Peloponnesian War, after the Persian Wars, before the Peloponnesian. So from the 470s, they go down to about 450, so about 15 plus years before what we're interested in today. But what I'm putting it round for is that it gives you an idea of both sides. So it shows you lots of Persian stuff, what sort of equipment the Persians wore. It gives you an idea of what Greeks wore. There's reconstruction of battle engagements. And it also gives you naval as well as military stuff. So broadly speaking, the Athenian Empire, as we call it, was founded upon the fact that they and their allies controlled the Aegean. And they controlled it mainly in the interests of Athens. It benefited Athens more than any other single ally. But the alliance had been founded on an anti-Persian basis. So quite rightly, after defeating the Persians go away, but they can always come back. The victories of defense had not seriously undermined the Persian Empire or its military strength, and therefore there was always the possibility they'd come back. Plus, some Greek cities down this bit of Asia Minor had been Greek for hundreds of years, and they were still in the Persian Empire. So part of the point of the alliance was to free those Greeks to become free like the Greeks of the mainland. So hence, the Athenians needed money from outside, unlike Sparta. Naval warfare is extremely expensive, not just to build ships, but to pay the crews, to train them. And then if there's an engagement, you're probably going to lose a lot of ships, so you have to start again. And one reason I don't show you slides of the trireme, which means a three-banked, as it were, glorified racing 8, 170 oarsmen disposed on either side of a lightweight galley in 3 banks, one right at the top. They're the best rowers. It's most difficult to row at that angle from the top. And then down to the grunts in the very basis. And if you can think in summer, with sweat, and I won't go into other bodily excretions down below. If you know about Aristophanes, perhaps, he makes jokes about what it's like to be someone down in the absolute bowels, literally, of a trireme oared warship. And then in between there's another level, which are better off than those right down below, but they're not as good rowers as the guys at the top. And there is a source which says that in the period of that magazine is covering, in order to gain and maintain the empire, the naval, they train 8 months a year. Now, some of you perhaps know, Greeks thought of the world and the seasons in terms basically of 2, that there is the sailing season and there is the not sailing season. They did have notion of spring and summer and autumn and winter, but Thucydides, for example, divides his year into 2, summer and winter. So winter, not sailing, summer, sailing and fighting. And so most of the encounters that I'm going to look at that took place in the Peloponnesian War took place between March, when the sailing season opens, and October, which is right at the end before the winter rains and storms of November, December, January, February. So that's the naval side. You may just be able to see, sporting a hoplite helmet. And hoplite means heavy armed infantryman, whose principal defensive armament is a hoplon, a 1 meter wide wooden shield, sometimes with bronze facing, sometimes with emblems, for example, a thunderbolt, that's me on the front. And the Spartans had developed a form of what we call phalanx warfare, going right back to the 7th century, so we're in the 600s. They'd come to their peak in the second half of the 6th century, so the 550 to 500s, such that when Herodotus starts to write Book 1, he's leading up to the events of 480, 479. He says there were 2 major powers already, right at the beginning of my account, in about 550, Sparta and Athens. And actually it's quite wrong to think of Athens as developed as that already. It had no navy until the 400s, until after Marathon it had virtually no navy. But he's completely right that Sparta already dominated most of the Peloponnese and then gradually built up an alliance, offensive, defensive, such that when the Persians came, the question arose, who should lead the Greeks who are bold enough and patriotic enough to resist? Who should lead the pick-up force, the alliance? Well, it had to be the Spartans, because half of those cities that agreed to resist were allied to Sparta. And that's why Sparta, it may seem strange, provided the admiral at the Battle of Salamis, which is a naval battle. And the Spartans contributed 16 ships. The Athenians contributed getting on for 300 ships. And of course the strategy and tactics were dictated by Athens, but still the overall admiral was a Spartan because of the nature of the alliance. Okay, on armaments, or would you like, does anybody want to come in at this point, ask anything more? All right, okay, so far. Right, well, we'll look then at sort of stuff that I, as it were, don't normally do, but principal battles and engagements. And I have put in bold type those, by year, those engagements which I'm going to ask you to think about and to look at in particular. And you have your map on the back if you wish to flick back and forward. So the war broke out in 431 for the reason that I said, that the Spartans voted in assembly that the Athenians had broken the peace or truce of 445. So therefore they were entitled, they had justification for attacking the Athenians. And yet, the way in which they chose to attack them, remember they lack the naval firepower. Attacking them by land was not actually going to win them the war, however much they thought it might. And so they, in the first 5 years or so of the war, they would every year, beginning of spring, send out quite a large Allied army. And they do what Allied armies do when they come to the territory of their enemy. They destroy the crops. And in the Greek climate and terrain, main cereal crops become ripe in April, May. So you set out in March or April, you encamp in the land of your enemy, and you lay waste as much as you can. But the longest ever expedition Spartans led in this phase of the war lasted 40 days. So we're talking about getting on for 6 weeks. Not huge, not enough to seriously damage the Athenians, who didn't depend on locally grown cereals or vines. It's more difficult to destroy vines, or olives. It's even more difficult to destroy olives, in the way that most other Greek cities did. And the reason for that was their navy, because a large amount of the grain supply for Athens came from up here, Ukraine, which may mean something to you today. And so it had to come through the Hellespont, private enterprise. It wasn't merchant marine. It's people who make a business of transporting goods of various sorts, and they knew they had a ready market in Athens. By getting wheat here, you take up there, you can't grow olives up here. So you give them olive oil, and in return you take wheat, bread wheat, and you bring it in. So that's the two-way trade. That's how it worked in the ancient world, which means, of course, the Hellespont, which is the Dardanelles, incredibly sensitive. The Bosphorus, this tiny channel here where now Istanbul is, whoever controls that is going to be in a very strong position. So the war breaks out, and the Spartan strategy is, as I described, it didn't work. And yet it was persisted with until 425. And I'll come on to 425 shortly. But I want first to illustrate Spartan inferiority, that's the alliance, at sea. Because in 430, 429, based at Naupactos, this is the Gulf, at the western end of the Gulf there of Corinth. This is the Saronic Gulf, that's the Corinthian Gulf. And at that point there is Naupactos, which was allied to Athens and very convenient as a naval base. One of Athens' 10 generals. Every year they elected 10 what they called generals, but they were of course admirals as well as generals if they're fighting on the sea. And the money that comes, it's from various sources, including private funding, but principally state funding, paying the crews, making sure that there are enough ships. Well, in 434-29, Phormion, based on Naupactos, had 20 triremes. Now each, as I've already mentioned, trireme crew is 170 oarsmen and 30 supernumerary, so marines and the steersman and the captain and all that sort of thing. So if you think of a trireme crew as 200, multiply that by 20, you get 4,000. And so there's a sizable number of men, but they were up against the Athenians 47 Corinthian triremes. So you'd think if they engaged in a narrow space as Salamis, the bigger armament would be able to crush, or at any rate would be unlikely to be routed that Thucydides gives a very detailed description and makes it clear that the sailors, the oarsmen and the steersmen of those 20 Athenian ships were far more experienced, far superior in skill to those of the Corinthians. And so that battle, one of the earliest naval battles, and that's why Thucydides makes a point of emphasizing it, there's a huge gap in quality between the Athenian navy and any Peloponnesian navy. Moving on to 425, I said that the strategy of annual invasions was in effect null and void. They were lucky, the Spartans, that the Athenians suffered plague in 430, which continued to affect and afflict the Athenians for 3 or 4 years, and eventually reduced the population, the adult male fighting population of Athens, by about 1/3. So I mean, that was a real stroke of luck. They didn't do anything to enable that, but the Athenians, being cooped up as they waited for the Spartans without going out to fight them, so they wait behind the walls of Athens, that did hasten the spread of infection during those maximum 6 weeks of siege. 425, the Athenians decide to take the war to the enemy. So they attack down this side, the far west, most of the southern half of the Peloponnese is Sparta's home territory, and they attack on the west coast. It's on your handout as Messenia and then Pylos. Pylos is on land. There's a little islet called Sphacteria. And the Spartans, seeing the Athenians come to attack and land and start to build a fort, they send a squadron, it's about 420 men, who then occupy the islet of Sphacteria in order to prevent any more Athenian forces coming to reinforce the Athenian advance party, and also to pen up, they hope, the Athenians building the fort on land. They will have to give in. As it turns out, a great fire breaks out on the islet of Sphacteria, exposing the force of only 420. The Athenians suddenly realize how few men they are actually opposed to, who have been sent to keep control of Sphacteria. And so battle ensues. The Athenians invade that island, and they win. I mean, it's guerrilla warfare rather than a pitched battle, because it's just a small rock in the sea. And the result of it is that the Spartans, for the first time in known history, this is a very significant moment, surrender. There is no earlier example of a Spartan force ever surrendering. Take Thermopylae, the famous resistance to the Persian attack on northern Greece. They die not quite to the last man, because actually 3 Spartans survive that attack at Thermopylae. But the notion of them just simply laying down their arms, there's a whole mythology about not laying down your arms and telling Xerxes, the Persian emperor, where he can get off. And so anyway, this is psychologically a terrific blow to Spartan morale. Plus, 120 Spartans are held hostage. We know all about hostages from Gaza, but there's a great deal of hostage taking during the Peloponnesian War. And they're held in Athens in a pen in public. And there's a story, Thucydides tells it, that one of Athens' allies, to get a rise out of them, goes up to the compound and says, "I thought you Spartans never surrendered." And Thucydides preserves what he takes to be the individual Spartan's response. And you probably know Spartans are famous for snappy apophthegmatus, snappy sayings. And he says, well, we weren't fighting men, because spindles, and the Greek word atraktoi means spindle in weaving, i.e. a woman's implement, which is a metaphor for arrows, cannot distinguish between brave men and cowards. So the fact that we gave into, as it were, womanly weapons doesn't reflect on our masculinity, but of course it did. It's just a very interesting exchange. So for the next 4 years, Sparta has to fight, as it were, with one hand behind its back, because they want those hostages back. The number of Spartan citizens, for various reasons, is shrinking, and they want to have absolutely everyone that they can keep on their side. But before 421, which is when the hostages finally get returned, there is a phase of warfare in which the Spartans shift their mode of attack away from Athens to northern Greece, so up towards Macedon, to this part, and including Macedon, Thessaly, Macedon. And why do they do that? Because Athens has lots of allies out there. And so one way of weakening Athens, and this is not original, it had been going on before the main war broke out, is to attack those allies and therefore weaken Athens' control of this crucial northern Aegean sphere which abuts the Hellespont. And it's very successful because a particular Spartan commander brings over a number of these northern Greek former allies of Athens, and one of them in particular, a place called Amphipolis. Amphipolis had been founded by Athens only 13 years before, 437. So it had an Athenian founder, it's an official subordinate colony of Athens. And it decided it'd rather be on the side of Sparta than on the side of Athens in this war. So it was betrayed, there was a treachery, and the Spartan forces were admitted by treachery, and they took over the city. Thucydides was posted, as it happened, as a general in that very theatre, but he was too far away to save. It's been like the relief of Mafeking. He failed to relieve Amphipolis, and for that he got exiled. And it would have coloured, I'm quite sure, his entire view of the war and individuals on the Athenian side as well as his view of Sparta. Anyway, 424, same year as that battle of the taking of Amphipolis. There is a battle which I won't go into, a battle of Delium, not far from Athens, which the Athenians lose, and that means that there's a truce sworn in 423. So for a year or so, there's no actual fighting. But someone on the Athenian side, someone on the Spartan side, they saw no future for themselves, for their own careers, if fighting was at an end. So they did all they could to stimulate both sides to resume fighting. And that happened right up in the north at Amphipolis, 422, the Battle of Amphipolis, which the Spartans, now in control of Amphipolis, they come out and they defeat the Athenian force. And the two principal, partly military men, partly political, on each side, they both die, they're both killed in the Battle of Amphipolis, paving the way for peacemaking, and peace is concluded in 421. Peace is concluded, but still the Athenians hang on to the hostages. So the Spartans, as it were, eat humble pie. They say, Athens, we'd like to make with you a separate treaty of alliance, separate, that is, from the peace treaty in which both alliances are making peace. Now, Sparta as Sparta and Athens as Athens swear an alliance supposed to last for 50 years. It lasted about 3. But the main point for Sparta was to get back the hostages, which they did. And on the other side, the Spartans wanted the Athenians to swear a very remarkable clause. If and then the Greek word means the slave estate, the slave population, should rise up, then you, Athenians, swear you will come and help us suppress that rising. Who were these slaves, these enslaved persons? They were helots, Greek word meaning captives. They were the economic basis of the Spartans' entire way of life. I won't go into all the details, but if helots revolt, that causes a major problem. Helots are Greeks. They're of the same ethnicity as their oppressors, their conquerors, their, if you like, masters. And so they were potentially always liable to want to exploit any weakness in their masters. And the Spartans were pretty weak in 421. They had to get back 120. They were prepared to make big concessions to get back just 120 Spartans. So that's the end of what Thucydides calls, and some of us do, the 10 Years' War, to distinguish it from the entirety of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 421. But despite the alliance, personal, between Sparta and Athens, for various reasons complicated, especially the role of Argos, seeing Sparta's weakness, appealing to Athens to take its side against Sparta, to actually take them on in a major pitched battle, the first major pitched land battle between the two sides, technically in the time of peace, but actually they're going to be fighting in northeast Peloponnese, so between Sparta and Athens. And that particular battle, Thucydides goes to great lengths to describe, and he lists the forces on both sides. But he says, I found it very difficult to find out exactly how many Spartans died in this encounter. It's very interesting that that's the thing that he should wish to know. Spartans won, and they won heavily. But some of us think that Thucydides got one of the basic elements of his description completely wrong. In other words, he underestimated by half the number of Spartans and others on their side that the Athenians were fighting against, because he misunderstood the structure of the Spartan army. It's very complicated, I won't go into it, but it is possible that Thucydides, the wonderful, in many ways, historian, made an absolutely fundamental category error in describing this major war. There were about 9,000, we think, on the Spartan side. There were about 9,000 plus on the Athenian side, half of whom were from Argos. So Argos had more at stake in the outcome of a hoplite battle, pitched battle, fought not far from their city, whereas Athens is quite a long way away, and Athens is principally a naval power. So what matters to Athens much more is victories and defeats at sea, whereas a victory on land for Sparta had the effect of restoring the morale that they had lost in 425, but didn't fundamentally alter the balance of power. Now I stress morale because I think it was Napoleon, I may have got this wrong, but said that the factor of morale is 3 times as important as all the other factors, the variables contributing to success or failure in a military operation. 3 times morale factor outweighs all the rest. Now, I'm sure he was exaggerating for effect, but I actually think that's an extremely important observation. I've quoted it many times myself. So, we are in 418. We've got as far as that. How are we doing for time? Are
Good,
we all right?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I don't want to bore on.
No, go on, this is
And I'm
great.
supposed to be, as an honorary citizen of Sparta, I'm supposed to be laconic, which means smart. in ancient Greek. Anyway, so the next phase of the war, there is a hiatus between 421 and 413, interrupted by this Battle of Mantinea, interrupted by what I consider to be a deeply mistaken sideshow, which the Athenians embarked upon way off to the west in Sicily. And so while there's technically peace with Sparta, and they're not actually fighting each other in mainland Greece or in the Aegean, Athens sends huge numbers of ships and men to conquer not just Syracuse, which is the principal city of Sicily and is allied to Sparta, but the whole of the island. And one of the arguments put forward is, well, it's got lots of resources, and will be enabled, if we can draw on the resources of Sicily for the next round of attacking the Spartans, well, it'll be game over, and the Spartans, Peloponnese, would be trapped between us controlling Sicily and us controlling the Aegean, and they're penned in the southern Peloponnese. Well, of course, it ends in disaster. Thucydides devotes, of what survives, about a quarter of his entire work, which covers 20 years, he devotes to just 3 years. A quarter of his entire work was so important, because looking back from the end of the war, you could see that this was a tipping point. And you could say in retrospect, had Athens not gone in for that Sicilian adventure, then they would have been better placed when, if the war resumed, as it actually shortly did. And it shortly did because while they were attacking Sicily, they also attacked, again, Sparta's home territory, not the far west, but this time the far east. So they sent a fleet from Athens to invade Sparta's territory, to sort of annoy the Spartans, to disrupt them in their own backyard, and maybe kill off a few people in that region and so on. It wasn't likely to cause serious long-term damage, but it was enough for the Spartans to say, you've invaded us, therefore you've obviously broken. There's no question about who's broken the peace of 421. You have. And so they start fighting again. And they start very interestingly, and I put it on the handout, the last period, 413 to 404, is really two quite separate wars. So there's, in mainland Greece, the Spartans come across the Peloponnese and camp just north of Athens. They occupy a fort and a town within Athens' territory, between their allies in Thebes and Athens itself, cutting off the Athenians from their own lands for a long time, not 40 days, but 8 years. And that element of their campaign is led by one of the two Spartan kings, which shows you how important they thought that aspect of the war was. But the decisive bit of the entire war is what we call the Ionian War. And Ionia is the middle bit of Western Turkey. So it's used in an extensive way for all of that bit of the Greek world and the Aegean, leading up to the Hellespont, the Bosphorus, and so on. And that is a naval war. And as you see, it starts well for the Athenians, 411, 410. But what I've not put on the handout here, the Persians come in 412, not in terms of supplying boots on the ground, as we tend to say today, but supplying money. And they give an awful lot of gold and silver to pay for ships, to pay for mercenary rowers, to pay for captains, all sorts of things, supplies. So eventually the Spartans and their allies, who start out pretty poorly, you can see they lose the first two battles against the Athenians, even though they've now started to get Persian money. It takes a while for that to be translated into success on the sea. But by the time of, and I've cut a few corners here of course, 406 BC, they are able to match the Athenians in terms of numbers of ships. Now that's still not the same as being able to match them in quality of command, strategy, tactics, evolution of the battle. The Battle of Arginusi, just off the island of Lesbos in the northeast Aegean, was fought between 140 triremes on the Spartan side and something like 150 triremes on the Athenian side. The Athenians thought this battle was so important that they sent 8 of their 10 generals, admirals, to command various ships and to command the operation. And the Athenians won. They won the battle, but they lost the immediate aftermath because, for various, mainly political reasons, there was a right-wing element in Athens, which is quite keen actually on overthrowing the democratic constitution of Athens, and who actually thought of Sparta quite fondly. They sort of welcomed the fact that their democratic city wasn't doing so well. We all know, don't we, about people like this in different parts of the world. And so there's a great court case, and actually the assembly was illegally used as a kangaroo court, and the 8 generals were accused of dereliction of duty because they had failed to rescue many hundreds of Athenian sailors who were left on blazing hulks. And the general said, we couldn't rescue them. The burning, we just couldn't get near them. And you could understand, that seems reasonable. But the opponents of both democracy and of the way in which the admirals had conducted the campaign exploited this phenomenon of grief. And they dressed themselves and their supporters in mourning clothes, even if they weren't necessarily related to any of the people who had died on those ships. So those generals, 8 of them, were all condemned to death. And it's sort of like Stalin in the Second World War, having a number of his generals executed. Didn't do much for the Athenian military cause, let alone its morale. And so, partly coincidentally, but partly self-inflicted, along comes, for the first time, a seriously good Spartan admiral, a man called Lysander, who gave his name, ironically, to a kind of aircraft in the RAF in the Second World War, but actually he was a naval man, not an airman. And he so arranged things. He was very pally with one of the sons of the reigning Persian monarch. He struck a personal relationship, and so increase of funds, and eventually he manages to bottle up an Athenian fleet in the Hellespont, the Dardanelles today. 180 of them, thousands of men, something like 36,000. And by a trick, he notices that the Athenians take their breakfast, which has been the only meal of the day, at a certain time. And so he waits till they've gone on shore and they're not in military preparedness, and that's when he goes in one day and attacks them. And so it's all over very shortly. He then compounds his victory by cutting off the right hands of crews that are caught alive as opposed to killed in the battle. So they can't actually run. And they have to somehow make their way back to Athens, where you can imagine the effect on morale of people without their right hands, arriving back on crippled hulks with the Spartan fleet coming behind to bottle up the whole of Athens, to put it under siege, which he does for about 4 months, and the Athenians starve. And so they have to surrender in March, April 404. So the final battle is a funny kind of naval encounter. It's not a pitched naval encounter in the way that Arginusi was, or Kyzikos, or any of the others. But nevertheless, the Spartans, with Persian help, unpredictably win at sea, which is previously the Athenian sphere of dominance. And if you have been, thank you very much for listening.
Who's got the first question?
Hello.
Oh, sorry, no.
Could you go into the mechanics of the naval warfare? To what extent was it a few hoplites on the top of a Union ship, or was it surrounding it?
Well, Thucydides is good on this because he says the old way of naval fighting was quite right. Two ships come near to each other and the Marines fight. So it's a land warfare on board ship. The thing about the Athenian way of doing fighting on the sea, yes, there's a ram, it's a bronze ram, and that is used to hold the enemy ships, ideally in the midships. And there are two basic tactics if you find yourself up against an enemy in line, in array. One is you go round, you circle round them and cause them to bang into each other and fall into disarray. And then when the confusion is sufficient, you then dart in and hit them amidships. The other way, much more dangerous, but it depends on speed of rowing, accuracy of attack. You've got two enemy ships here, they each have their oars like that. You go between them and shear off the oars on either side with yours, and then you turn round and whack them in the stern as opposed to in the midships. And there are different Greek words. The circling is periplus, sailing around, and the going through and then is diekplus, so through, out, sailing. So you go in and out, and extremely difficult. Hoplite warfare relatively is much more boringly straightforward. You've got, let's say, 10, 15,000 facing each other. Crack troops are on each side's right. So first of all, the encounters are there, and if they're equal, then one side comes this way and the other goes. Spartans were typically better than any other hoplite force facing them. So they, the Spartans, were on the right, their allies lined up, and then the next best allied force on the far left. And more often than not, and there aren't that many set-piece encounters, but the Spartans would simply, partly by terror, I mean, you'd be a bit frightened seeing these guys coming, wearing one of these helmets, encased in bronze, and with a huge shield, and the spear up here, pointed either at your neck or your groin. And you're not wearing, you've got greaves, but they don't have a terrific amount, no chain mail, there's no sort of serious body protection. So a lot of it is morale and courage of a certain sort. And the best fighters are in the front, including in Spartan's case, the king, who's commanding. He's right front and centre. It's not a case of the Duke of Placitorium leading his army from behind. Yeah.
I read one of the translations, Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. What struck me, maybe I've got something wrong, but that the actual campaigns are really quite conventionally done, rather dull.
Absolutely.
And actually the best bit is, of course, the Pericles oration and the discussions that the Athenians have. Do you think that's deliberate, or is it really because actually the campaigns, they advanced a bit, they went back, and that's all that seems to happen, unless I'm missing something.
You're not. I mean, that is typically how Greek hoplite warfare happens. There are light troops, there are archers, there are people with javelins, so it's not quite as simple as I've described it. There are cavalrymen, and very few on the Spartan side, and very few on the very rarely do they make a difference. But look forward to Alexander's time, and Macedon, its principal force is cavalry. They also developed arrow-firing catapults so that you can start besieging cities and hoping to take them, even without treachery from within. There are all sorts of things that happen after the Peloponnesian War. So your impression from reading Thucydides is actually perfectly fair and correct. And I was expecting you to say something like, well, when the siege of Plataea happens, this is the Spartans and the Thebans in 420s. Plataea is an ally of Athens. For the first time, you get a complex sort of different forces, different type of tunneling, flaming arrows, a battering ram. And that's a siege of a relatively small city with relatively weak walls. So forget about besieging Amphipolis, which is big with a big city. Spartans never attempted to take Athens by siege. Their aim was to starve them out and make them want to either come out to fight and then they'd lose, or stay behind and eventually starve, but they never could themselves stay long enough to starve them out. And anyway, the Athenian supply line was typically by sea. But your impression of, as it were, regular hoplite tactics is entirely accurate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Then
you.
I'll come back.
I suppose it's more of an observation than a question, but I'd like to know if I'm on the right lines. I mean, you commented that Spartan power probably hit a peak at the start of the 5th century.
Yeah.
One feature of Sparta is the constant decline in the population of the full Spartan citizens, due to my mind, absolutely crazy citizenship policies. But they, in many ways, it seems to me, this was a war that Sparta was desperate to fight because it could see its numbers going down.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Athens was getting ever more powerful, ever wealthier.
Yeah.
And so they really had to
Now or never.
knock Athens out. And yet, it also seems to me that ultimately it was a war without winners, because obviously Athens lost and had most of its overseas empire confiscated. But at the same time, I mean, the Spartan citizen population had gone down dramatically by the beginning of the 4th century.
Right.
And ultimately it was to lose 25 years later and lose its hegemony. And at the same time, Sparta had depended upon the fact that they were essentially the only force of full-time professional soldiers in Greece.
Yeah.
Whereas after 27 years of warfare, you have thousands and thousands of men who have loads of military experience and have got used to serving as mercenaries. So that's another way in which Sparta's edge has been completely eroded.
All I'd say against what you said, with most of which I agree, is that Sparta really did win. And they won big. And as you say, the end of the Athenian Empire, which they never managed to recreate as such. And Sparta, for a few years, occupied exactly the position that the Athenians had in the Aegean, but in the whole of Greece. So for a very brief period, there was one top dog in the whole of Greece, the whole of the Eastern Greek world, not the Western Greek or North Africa. But Sparta, for those 6 years or so, 404 to 398 or so. However, what you anticipated is that within 10 years of having won this terrific victory, who were they fighting? They were biting the hand that had fed them at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Persia. And they were doing so in the name of all Greeks. So they were trying to be what Athens successfully had been for a long time, champions of Greek freedom from the Persian Empire. The Spartans became exceptionally unpopular because they weren't brilliant leaders of non-Spartan Spartans because they had a certain culture, and Spartans were trained from their very first years to be obedient, to be disciplined, not to criticize, not to question. And so you've got a bunch of unruly Greeks, much more used to the Athenian way of doing things, with many more democracies, and very few democracies in the Peloponnesian sphere. And so within 10 years, there is a coalition of Greeks funded by Persia. Why? Because Sparta had been attacking Persia. So as with the Athenians, you fund your enemy, and they funded, therefore, Athenians, Thebans, one of Sparta's Peloponnesian allies, Mantinea, and inevitably Argos, because Argos will always join any anti-Spartan grouping, if it possible, because it wants to be top dog in the Peloponnese, not in all Greece, but in the Peloponnese. So there was some, yes, at the back there.
I think I remember that when Plataea surrendered, the Spartans effectively either killed or sold into slavery the entire population of the city, or how big it was. And something similar happened to the Greek army that surrendered in Syracuse. Those guys spent the rest of their lives in the mines.
Well, not quite, no. Neither is actually quite
Okay,
correct.
well, that's one question. The second question is, given the proximity of these cities to each other, and to some degree they spoke the same language and had the same culture, what is the driver to be so harsh on that population? Is it because they had different household gods?
No.
Or what?
But
what
it's
explains that?
what we call polis particularism. So whereas we live in a nation state, which is of course a fairly recent development from the 19th century, the ancient Greeks developed an institution which is quite difficult to translate, but it's at the root of our modern language. Politics, political, police, all go back to polis, P-O-L-I-S, city-state or citizen state, with very tightly circumscribed ethnic, civic boundaries, so that you can't become an Athenian just by living there. You are an Athenian by birth or nothing. Ditto Sparta. So when you, as you rightly say, quite often this sort of mass murder or selling into slavery of people of another Greek city, well, they're not you. Yes, they're Greeks, but what you have in common as Greeks is less powerful than what binds you as Athenians. And there is a horrendous episode which Thucydides makes a very big song and dance about. There's a little island called Milos. Some of you may have been to it in the Cyclades, not far from Santorini. And Milos tried to be neutral between the Athenian alliance and Sparta, but it made the mistake of saying, we believe once upon a time our ultimate ancestors were Spartans. And so in effect, they were leaning towards the Spartan side. They also had a form of governance, which we call oligarchy, so just a few people, not democracy. And so when the Athenians say, which side are you on? You know, you've got to come clean, and we want you to join our alliance. And they say no. And this is in this interstitial period between the 10 Years' War and then the resumption of the Peloponnesian War after the Sicilian debacle, 416, 415. Athenians send a task force plus allies, not just Athenians. It's a walkover. And they have, this is Thucydides, a discussion in camera. So how on earth did you know what really was said? He couldn't have done. So he's making it up to illustrate what's at stake between a big power and a small power. And the Athenians give the Melians an alternative. You know, either you come over to us, or we're going to kill you. And they, in a way, bravely, but you could say foolishly, they insist they're not going to become allies of Athens. They are therefore either massacred or if they escaped. And one of them, famously, is thought to have escaped to Athens and become a student of Socrates. His name is Phaedo. He's thought to have actually been one of the Melian escapees. At any rate, most Athenians were not fussed at the thought that their task force had killed something like 500 Melians, because the Athenians then sent Athenians as settlers of Melos. But to go back to Plataea, the main enemy of Plataea was not Athens, ironically, but Thebes, because Plataea belonged to the ethnic group called Boeotians, geographically and the type of Greek they spoke, the gods that they privileged, and yet they were allies of Athens. So Thebes was particularly angry with the Plataeans, and once the Spartans had sieged them for 2 years and finally taken them, so the Plataeans are suppliants, they come out, spare us, the Thebans pile in, and Thucydides stages a kind of Nuremberg trial, if I can put it that way, and the Spartan judges, the Spartans send judges out from Sparta, and they call in the Plataeans and ask each of them a single question: what have you done for us in this war? And the answer obviously is nothing. And so execution. And then, to double down on that, the Thebans come in a year later and destroy the city of Plataea. And this is something in which we call herbicide, U-R-B-I, city killing, herbicide. And I've written an article, it appeared in the Cambridge World History of Genocide, so it's slightly actually stretching a point. But a number of examples going back to the 500s and carrying on through to, for example, the destruction of Thebes on the orders of Alexander the Great. 30,000 Thebans were either killed or exiled in 335. The city of Thebes was physically destroyed, with the exception of one house and any religious shrines, and it remained unoccupied. It didn't exist for 20 years. So you're completely right to put your finger on this aspect of inter-Greek warfare and politics is particularly brutal. I entirely agree. Yeah.
Can I ask you about what is the integrity of Thucydides' work? I mean, is there just one version of it which is accepted, or are there multiple versions?
There are multiple versions, and scholars way before me, beginning in the Renaissance, started doing manuscript comparison and creating what they call a stemma. So you try to find the archetype, the original manuscript from which every existing manuscript, of which there are not a huge number, but more than just one. But for some people, Lucretius, for example, one manuscript only survived, found in the late 16th century, and early 16th century, excuse me. So scholars have done all this work way before me, and I just take more or less on trust what the editors of the Teubner series in Germany, or the Oxford Classical Texts in this country, give me as a Greek text. And occasionally you'll get one word, and it really matters what the word is. And you've got two different versions in the down the bottom of the page where the different manuscript readings are listed. It's called the apparatus criticus, critical apparatus. And to me, or to a fellow historian, it might really matter whether he said this or that, but you can never be absolutely sure. So the answer is, his manuscript tradition is relatively sound. It's not one where, oh my God, it's dreadful, and we're more or less fighting in the dark to work out something approximating what he may have written. But on the other hand, what came down to the 15th century, this is when the Renaissance scholars in Venice and elsewhere get going. That is a terrific sort of conjecture only, and so the only kind of authentic tradition is, of course, papyrus from Egypt. And yes, there are bits and pieces of Thucydides and contemporaries opinion. Interesting is the whole historian. We call him the Oxyrhynchus historian. We think he was an Athenian, and we think he was a young contemporary of Thucydides who begins his history in 411, where Thucydides broke off. So we know that he's aware of Thucydides. But we only have a few bits on papyrus, so we can't reconstruct a work. Thucydides came down as an entire work, and there is a story that his editor, his first editor, was his daughter. And I like to think it was correct, actually. Because think of Milton. We have Milton because of his two daughters. And it's not impossible that a very smart daughter would have the dad's papers, and she would do the original work. It's always a puzzle to me how works as long as that ever acquired anything like book form, because papyrus was read in rolls. The Latin for that is volume, and so volume. And so it's not until the codex is invented, that is, pages side by side, which you turn over in about 200 AD. It's not till then that it's easy to pick up a book and read it. You have to unroll it one way, you read it, and then you have to roll it up, and extremely laborious. And how anybody remembered Thucydides, how did he, as it were, check what he'd written in book one? And these books are, by the way, well after Thucydides. The work was divided up for convenience of reference in Alexandria. So in the original, there are no book divisions and no sentence divisions. I mean, you've got to know Greek so well that you just read it, which of course you can do. I mean, I can't read Hebrew, and there are some people who can't read Hebrew, like my wife, without the diacritical dots above. But if you're a native Hebrew speaker, you don't need the dots for the vowels. You just read it. You know what the vowels to insert because it's native to you. And that's pretty much what reading Greek. It's all what the later medieval tradition calls unkiol, so small capitals. That's Greek, not cursive, small capitals.
So Thucydides was really a historical novelist, wasn't he? He was doing what people like William Boyd do today, basing his stories on the known fact, but taking the liberty of inventing things that people might have said or done.
Well, not done, because he makes a distinction. This is book 1, chapter 22. He says, so far as the narrative, that is the events, are concerned, my problem was when two people, or more than two, gave contradictory accounts, and I wasn't there. So what actually happened? But with speeches, he allows himself the liberty. He says, I've made the speakers say what I think they absolutely had to say, given the situation they were in and the case they were arguing. So he's not saying, I'm giving you a verbatim transcript of any speech. I wrote it in my language, my Thucydidean language, but I'm going to preserve for you. And then he says, the most important, as it were, the burden of the speech. So what was the principal objective of giving the speech and the principal argument or arguments? He doesn't say that he can faithfully reconstruct or attempt to reconstruct, even when he was present, the supporting arguments and the little verbal flourishes and so on. But reading a Thucydidean speech, he claims, so their main point was that, and their main argument in support of it was that. Whether it's true, we've no way of validating, because we don't have any alternative versions. But I would resist calling him a novelist, a fiction writer, because in a way all of us historians, we write the history. So in that sense we're all making it up. But there is a kind of constraint, which is you can't imagine stuff for which there is no possible evidence. That's today. And Thucydides only allowed himself license in speech writing, not in the narrative. So I think we must give him the credit for that.
Okay, we're going to have to break there. I'm sure we've got more questions, but we'll have them during the dinner, if that's all right, Paul.
Well, thank you
Thanks
very
so
much.